Good morning, brothers and sisters. I hope y'all have all had a good week. And I was sitting there thinking while Steve was talking, we was singing this morning that our young people's class, we started at the beginning, Genesis 1:1, and we've made it so far to, we're going to hopefully finish up the the book of Exodus this morning. And I was sitting there thinking, well, at the rate we've been going, I should live to be 100 years old if I ever make it to Revelation. So I got something to look forward to, maybe, if I'm lucky, blessed. But like I said, we're going to be in the book of Exodus today. Our class has made it somewhere around 38 and 39. This book of Exodus, we started out in Genesis, our class did, and as I go through and read this, I think about the importance of the Old Testament. Not just the fact that I actually enjoy reading stories out of the Old Testament or hearing preaching on the Old Testament and stuff like that. And I'm not trying to take away by the New Testament at all, but it kind of lays the groundwork for me, and it really did when I was first saved, because when you're saved, God saves you, and then God ends up revealing Himself to you, and that's through the teachings and His Word, His truth, the Bible that we stand here today. So for the young people, I hope that they gain something by reading this Old Testament and that's what we basically do every Sunday. We don't do a super in-depth study, but we read through it, we talk about it, we try to see the relevance in it, and I hope God exposes to the fact that when these young people, and myself, I'm learning too as we go along, that you don't just see the story of the beginning, and like where we're in Exodus, where these God's chosen people are leaving Egypt, they get out of Egypt and all that, but there's a personal story that when I read it, I see myself living through the Old Testament there. God's people were slaves in Egypt, just like the non-believers are slaves to sin, whether they know it or not. And then it's hard to get away from Egypt sometimes. And then you see where God's people, when they do get out of Egypt, what's some of the first things they want to do? They want to go back to Egypt. So that's where I see the picture of myself as a sinner after God saves you. They have rough times. They have bad thoughts. There's even a mixed multitude that leaves with God's people when they leave Egypt. And what importance does anybody say about what does that matter? Well, when that new believer leaves out and starts studying God's Word and getting out and on their own, what happens if they get tangled up with a mixed multitude of non-believers after they're a new believer? It don't always turn out so good, brothers and sisters. There's a lot of similarities in the human story, as you put it, the individual story, that when I read this Old Testament, I see that struggle as an individual, just like God's people saw it. And Abram knew this, God created the heavens and the earth. I believe that wholeheartedly, in the number of days said. Then God created Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve had children, and we go through the period where man gets out of control, and then God destroys the earth. Noah survives in his family, and the earth gets repopulated. We get to the point where you got Abram in Ur, what would be modern day Iraq or Iran, somewhere right there in that part of the world, and God calls him to go to this promised land. And Abram does. But poor old Abram, he is the star of the show when we're in that part of the book. But the star of the show can make mistakes too. That's what our class, I try to show them as we move through these chapters. Everybody knows poor old Abram, when he's put under pressure by when he goes to visit Pharaoh in Egypt, what do they tell him about his wife? That's his sister. What kind of man is going to do that? That's a man that makes mistakes under pressure. But God makes promises to Abram. God tells him his offspring is going to be like the stars in the sky, or the sand on the seashore. And he makes a promise, that that's going to happen. And this is during Abram's like, well, I'm an old man. I forget how old he was. He might have been 90 or 100 years old. I don't know. Sarah, his wife, was old too. And God's telling him this, and Abram, he's hanging in there. And then his wife kind of chuckled about it, made fun about it. Well, lo and behold, it happened. And Abram has Isaac. And then Isaac, he's got his own story. Go back and read it. One of Abram's main men goes and finds him a wife and brings her back. And then they end up having a son, Jacob. Two brothers, Jacob and Esau, both born together at the same time there. There's a story in that. It's worth going back and just reading that, how that goes down there. But anyway, Jacob ends up having a bunch of sons, and for me, probably the most famous of them, we all know, is going to be Joseph. And there again, when you read the story of Joseph and what he goes through, he is sold by his brothers, his own people, done in by his own people. And anyway, he ends up doing time in prison. He's falsely accused. He ends up being the head honcho in, of all places, Egypt. In all places for him to end up was in Egypt. And this is where it gets really good too in this story. Because when he's in there, there's a famine coming. The Pharaoh, who has dreams, needs somebody to tell him what they mean. And we know from day one, Joseph was a dream guy. Made his brothers mad at him. He was so good at dreams. He's telling them about the dreams he was having. And that's part of the reason they became jealous and sold him into slavery. But here's a famine coming in the land of Egypt. And I know it's taking me a minute to get there, but let's just come on me here this morning. I'm enjoying the story. I enjoy the story. I like telling the story. But, Joseph has them get ready. They put up grain and food enough to last 7 years, I believe it was. Supposed to be 7 good years and then 7 bad years. So during the good years, they put up enough food to get through the bad years. Well, lo and behold, up in the land where Joseph came from, up in what I call Canaan land, God's land up there, what modern day people who are uneducated, don't fully understand history, have probably never heard a word in the Bible of God, who want to call this land Palestine. You know where the name Palestine came from? Who gave that land the name of Palestine? Of all people, the Romans. And we know how late on the scene the Romans showed up. Now you take all of them years prior to the Romans ever being in what I call Canaan land, the promised land, however you want to call it there, but it ain't Palestine. That is something the Romans come up with to actually just to make the God's people, the Israelites is what I call them, the Jews, if you want to call them that now, is to make them illegitimate, like they never belonged there, like they were never there, is what all that's been done for years and years, ever since the Roman times. The Romans tore down, sacked Jerusalem, ruined the country. They wanted to obliterate God. They tore down the temple. They wanted to get rid of anything related to God and the Jewish, our God, the one true God. The Romans wanted, and they'd done a good job at it. It took all the way, to 1947 for the world to finally recover and get the Jewish people back in the land? All them years prior, from 70 A.D., when Jerusalem was sacked by the Romans, to 1947. What is that, 1,900 years roughly? That's a long time. That's how long they had started with Rome, had created the mess there, trying to keep God's people out of God's land that he promised to Abram. And that's where we're at today. And a lot of people who are watching TV or whatever, and they hear this Palestine, free Palestine, let Palestine have what's theirs. It wasn't even called Palestine until 70 A.D. God's people had done been on the earth, had done been in that land, had been kicked out by the Babylonians, had returned with Ezra, rebuilt a temple again. They had been there a long time. And so anyway, that come to my mind there, that how these people we hear on TV, they don't have a clue. They just think Palestine, their history ain't, I'm going to say it's shallow is what it is. It just really don't go back far at all if they want to believe that. And I'll argue that with anybody right there as far as that. Their history being shallow, if they want to call that the land of Palestine, the Palestinians. It was the people that was there first. God sent his people in there to expel them. And that was a rough story. I mean, for a believer, you look at it, but that was God's order. And they failed in some aspects, and that's how they ended in so much trouble after that, because they didn't do what God told them to do when they went into that promised land. God at times told them to get rid of everybody that was in there. Because y'all remember when Joshua and then the other 7 went in as spies to see what they was going to take in the Canaan land, the promised land. And some of them got scared and went back and reported back to Moses and everybody else in the camp. We're like grasshoppers. They're bad, and that's why God told them they needed to get rid of them. But I'm going off in a whole different direction now. But anyway, all that led up to the book of Exodus is where we're at today. And we talked about that. Yeah. And here we are. I'm going to pick up. I told you a while ago that, Exodus is really in 3 parts, which I kind of covered. But God's people were dominated in Egypt. That's chapters 1 through 12 of the book of Exodus. And then the second section, if we divide this up in 3 sections of Exodus 13 through 18, is they're freed from Egypt. So that's where we're at in Exodus, the middle part of the book. They're freed, and that's where we got to talk. I talked about a while ago where they're leaving Egypt. They're leaving sinful Egypt, the hard labor, the brickyard, if you want to call it, the land of hard labor. And they're freed, and they're leaving that, and lo and behold, they start having flashbacks. Boy, this traveling in the wilderness rough. What have you done to us, Moses? We need to go back to Egypt. Be easier. And we all remember that. And then the third part, 19 through 40, is kind of like God revealing himself of what's happening once they're freed. And that's kind of a personal struggle too. You're dominated by Egypt, if you won't call Egypt. The sinner is dominated by sin, whether it be, it can be just very mean, evil-looking, I don't know how to describe it, just bad. Sin can be like that, can be bad, and be controlled by it. That's kind of the way I see Egypt in a way for some of them. Those brick makers, the ones making the bricks, you remember seeing in the 10 Commandments way back, and when they're stomping in the mud, that's a real hard scene, making bricks, etc. And I know that's exaggerated, but I still picture that as a kid watching the 10 Commandments. But there's other people that was in Egypt there too, whether you think about it. They were slaves, but they had easy jobs. They were probably servants in the rich Egyptians' homes, and they probably had the best foods to eat. They had to make the beds or whatever they done. You don't think about those people. Man, living a life like that with you pretty much being taken care of and living in the best places could be built at the time. It'd be hard to get into the wilderness and leave that right there. And that's that kind of domination of Egypt, if you want to call it, that's hard to get away from because it's so nice and sweet and pretty. But it ain't good for you. It ain't good to be a slave, period. It ain't good to be controlled by sin, period. It don't matter if it's at making them bricks or if it's waving the fan for some princess or something like that. It seems easy, but it's still, you're under control by somebody else. You're not free. And, of course, 19 through 40, where we're finishing up now, is a revealing after you've been freed. It's what this building of the temple, or not temple, but the tabernacle is a lot of what we've covered in chapters 19 to where we're at now. We're actually going to finish up on that today, is where they've been building the tabernacle. And this tabernacle, y'all know, is not the temple, of course, but it's going to be like a portable, I want to call it like a portable temple. It's got its dimensions. I think it was, 150 feet long by 75 feet wide with an outside curtain of 7.5 feet tall. It was to be put in the middle, in the center of God's people as they were traveling in the wilderness. That's where God should be, right in the middle, right in the center of everything. That's where it was to be put. Think about it. Not off to the side, not onto the back, but right in the middle where they could all. Now, they couldn't just see right into what the priests were doing with the animals, the sacrifice and all that. But it was in the center. Okay. So I'm going to pick up chapter 38 of Exodus. And I'm just going through here because we done covered some of this in my class. I'm going to highlight a little bit of it. I think, like I said, this is a repeat of what we've read in chapters 20, roughly 25, back in the middle here, when Moses come down off of Mount Sinai and God had give him the dimensions of the temple and what all was, not temple, but tabernacle, and what all was to be made. It was to be made out of certain cloths, certain ways put together, certain dimensions, and there were going to be certain things. And God laid all of that out to what it was going to be like. So we're pretty much on replay right here of what we're going through. They're actually going to put it together now is where we're going to be at. And then Moses is going to inspect it. And this tabernacle is going to end up being put in the middle of the camp. And so inside of this tabernacle, I can't get that straight in my mind, is going to be the laver. Before the laver, I skipped that part, is going to be the altar. That's where the sacrifice was performed. When you first walk in there, it had certain dimensions. I think it was overlaid with bronze. The stuff it's overlaid with, made out of gold, and as further you get into the temple, or not temple, but as further you get into the tabernacle, the closer you get to the presence of God in the Holy of Holies back there, that's where you start seeing the things covered with gold, etc. Out here on the outside areas is going to be those things made of bronze. All right, so we had the altar of what we read there. Now we're getting down to verse 8, and we're going to have the laver, a wash basin of all things in there. And what's unique about this, where we read in here, let me see, I don't know if verse 8 tells. And he made the laver of brass, and the foot of it of brass, of the looking glasses of the women assembling, which assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. Exactly. All right, you got this big laver made of brass, and the Bible tells us, God's truth tells us, all that metal necessary to make that was taken up from the ladies. They donated their mirrors. So vanity ain't just in these days. It's been around for a long time. So, this is back almost into the beginning. But they were willing to donate those mirrors. And they had gotten to this point. If you'll remember, when they left Egypt and Moses was up on the mount getting the first set of 10 commandments, these God's people and this mixed multitude that was with him, they got a little impatient. And they had all this gold with them. If you'll remember, if you think back, when they left Egypt, the Egyptians was wanting them out of there because they had been through a horrendous amount of suffering and stuff that God had put forth on the land of Egypt. He was saying, let my people go. And Pharaoh was so stubborn. And think about, he was so stubborn, did not want to relinquish control of something so bad that he'd make his whole country suffer. Well, it got so bad that when he finally said, when his firstborn died, you remember, the Passover, when the death angel goes through the land of Egypt, and the firstborn of Pharaoh dies, and he finally had about all he can stand. And they leave, and the Egyptians give God's people their gold earrings, their jewelry, and everything, like, out of here. Glad to see you go, brother. Get out of here. So they leave out of Egypt, not only free, but they carrying a ton of gold, because we'll get some dimensions here in a minute if I read through some of that I think it was actually like a ton of gold that they used to make some of the stuff right here in the tabernacle. So that's a lot of gold coming out of the land of Egypt. That's how the people of Egypt wanted them out of there. And so anyway, obviously they had a lot of brass, and the ladies had a bunch of mirrors that they carried with them. And after this I left this part out too. When Moses come back down and then made that golden calf, I get sidetracked sometimes. They got impatient, made that golden calf out of all that gold they brought out of Egypt. Moses comes down and they're singing and dancing. I think Joshua was about halfway up on the mountain with him, and they're coming down off the mountain. Moses got the 10 Commandments, and I think Joshua said, "Man, I hear a warring in the camp down there, something." And Moses told him, said, "No, it's singing and dancing." Well, lo and behold, they'd made that golden calf down there, and they'd went nuts, and they were dancing around this thing, and Moses got mad. I'm just making this a short story. Moses comes down, he gets mad, he takes the 10 Commandments, he's so mad, he throws them down and breaks them. Now we see, we talked about Abram, he had his shortfalls. He told Pharaoh his wife was his sister. Jacob, he had his faults, if you'll remember. Another patriarch of the Bible, Jacob had his faults. He was deceitful, number one. He took advantage of poor old Esau when he was in a bad way, took his birthright away from him. And then he conspired with his mother to get the rest of what his dad was going to leave for the brothers. He got that away from him. But he was shrewd too, because he ended up with old Uncle Laban, he was a pretty sharp character too. He ended up getting Jacob to work for him. 14 years to marry one of it, one daughter and then the other daughter. But anyway, Jacob, he was pretty shrewd too. He ended up coming out of that deal with 2 wives and plenty of livestock. And when he hit the road, so Jacob had his shortfalls too. These great men, they got issues too. Everybody's got issues, what I like to say. Got ups and downs. And if you can't see it, and what you see in the Old Testament with some of it had the communication with God himself. And Moses here, he's quick to anger. He sees them, he didn't just drop down immediately and lay the 10 Commandments down and start praying for these people. He got mad and he threw them 10 Commandments down. But God wasn't pleased with this situation either, because you got this mixed multitude and these people that were influenced. You had some, I think, if we make it that far here in a couple of chapters, when one of the people putting the temple together, one of them, Jewish tradition says that one of them's grandfather actually got up and tried to get them to stop, and they ended up killing him. So it might not have been just a pretty party, the whole thing, the way it went down. But that was a Jewish tradition story right there. That you get into one of those, and if we get time, we'll read it. But so that that's how we get to this point where, because some of these people died, the God's judgment was on it, and they were done in at this period in time when they made this golden calf. Moses is coming down off the mount with the 10 Commandments, and the first one is like, "You shall not have no other God before me." It's hot off the press, y'all. And he ain't even got off the mountain. And here they already made another false god out of gold. And you think God's going to be pleased with that? No, he wasn't. And like I said, you go back and read the story, not everybody survived that mess when they done that. And the other ones that did live through this are sorrowful now. And they want to do things to help God. They want to put this temple together. They donated so much gold and stuff that I think the men collecting the gold, we read earlier chapters, like, too much. We've got enough. We don't need no more. These God's people were sorrowful after this event. It went down after this golden calf incident. And I think the ladies were sorrowful enough, and I'd say that Moses got all the mirrors he needed to make this laver out of this brass mirrors. And that's where we're at now. Okay. All right, verse 8. And Okay, another thing to remember too, and about this tabernacle. Some people are like, it's boring, it's boring, it's boring, these dimensions and all that. But if you flip over, and we don't do now, we ain't got enough time to, but Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5, if I read it, it says Moses, when he was on the mount, he was shown, what he was shown was this tabernacle to be built. And it is exactly, in Hebrews 8, is a shadow of heavenly things when he was up there on the mount, when he got these directions from God to put the tabernacle together. And also in Revelation 4, if you remember, John can see into heaven, if you remember in Revelation 4. And keep this in mind, that in Hebrews 8, we're saying Moses, the dimensions for the tabernacle and everything in the tabernacle is kind of a shadow of things that'll be in heaven. So that should be really important to everybody. And you got to get into some of that. And like me, I don't fully understand all of it yet, trying to get these pictures. And you get into the events that happen at the tabernacle and so forth like this, the holidays and all that. Those are all pictures of things to deal with heaven. And just like this tabernacle here. And in Revelation 4, John looks up and he sees God on the throne. He sees an altar of incense. And you remember the candlestick? It's in the temple. It's got 7 candles in it. John saw 7 fires, spirits of fire when he was in heaven, when he was looking up. And but one thing that's pretty neat, and that's how I'm going to tie it into what we just talked about, the laver. He didn't see a laver. He didn't say nothing about seeing the laver in there. But he was standing on what? He was standing on something like glass, like crystal. All right, so he's there and there's no laver anymore, but he's standing on that glass before the throne of God. And in the tabernacle, if you're standing there looking toward the Holy of Holies, where God, would accept the sacrifice, the blood sacrifice once a year in there, is that laver in the front. Well, what's in the laver? It's water, it's clear, but that was for cleansing. All right, think about it. The priest had to cleanse their hands and the feet before the high priest, before he went in that for sure into that Holy of Holies, he had to wear certain clothes, and not the fancy clothes once a year. When he went in that Holy of Holies, I'm just getting it all mixed up now. But anyway, there was a certain procedure and process for getting into the Holy of Holies when you went in there. And this laver was out front to cleanse. But the big thing is, this is at the tabernacle, and when Solomon, y'all remember, now this tabernacle eventually is going to end up being permanent, in a permanent place, going to be Jerusalem. David, like in Exodus, gets all the materials together, and then Solomon builds this thing, but there's no specs, if you remember what we just read on how big the laver's to be. And I think that's because it's a picture of what we're going to see when John's on this solid glass floor in there. There ain't no cleansing needed no more in the future. What he's looking in there to see heaven, that glass is the finished work of Christ, is what you're going to see. That's like a picture of Christ to come. If you really look at it and tie it together, you'll see that. And but anyway, Solomon built this laver. I get the story all mixed up here, cart before the horse. But it was called, and he made it so big and so huge. Of course, by then the temple was processing, the population of Jerusalem was huge by then, and they were processing a lot of sacrifices on the altar outside. And I mean, that could be part of it, but Solomon made this thing. It was huge. It was called the Molten Sea back then. And so that was a sign of all that cleansing it was needed. But in heaven, what John saw was no laver. It wasn't there anymore, but he was standing on that glass. That's solid like crystal. That's like the finished work of Christ in the future is what that's going to be. That signifies that. It's what that was for heaven. All right. And in this same verse, it's talking about the laver. just a little side story on these ladies. Let me see let me make sure I read the right verse for you on that. All right, try to tie this in together for you. In this verse 8, these ladies that donated these mirrors and stuff, the population that's left are sorrowful for what they done at the bottom of Mount Sinai, and they made this golden calf. So they donated. But these ladies, who are these? They stand outside the temple. They're going to, not temple, but the tabernacle. They're going to stand outside the front curtain of the tabernacle. And Jewish tradition says they prayed and tried to do anything they could to help God and the priest within. They couldn't go in, but they would stand outside the entrance and probably sing and pray and, whatever was, to let everybody know that, hey, we are here to support the priest and so forth in here. And we know later on, Aaron's the first high priest. We get there. I got another minute or two. Anyway, Aaron's the first high priest. And later on, there comes another priest in the book of Samuel. And his name is, I got it written, Eli. Y'all remember the high priest Eli? Well, he had a couple of sons. They were bad seed, if you'll remember. And that's who was going to help Eli, the high priest, his sons, in that tabernacle, do that work in there. And Jewish tradition, now this is Jewish tradition, the Bible does not tell this. But, well, yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. I'm getting the first part with the Jewish tradition is they sang out, these ladies outside the curtain sang and prayed for the priest within. I'm getting it straight now. They prayed for the priest within. They supported them with that prayer. But what we find out later on in the Bible in Samuel, when Eli is a high priest, that his sons who work in there, you still got the ladies who are outside the tabernacle supporting God and supporting the priest with prayers daily out there. Well, Phineas and, man, I cannot remember how to say the other guy's name. Hoppius, something. Anyway, hard for me to say. I can't pronounce some of these. But Phineas, I remember plainly. If you'll remember in Samuel chapter 2, 1 Samuel chapter 2, that these guys ended up taking advantage of the women outside of the tabernacle. They actually slept with them, and God ended up being really mad and upset that they were taking advantage of God's people who were there on a legitimate reason to pray and help support the priest. But like I told you, Eli's sons were bad. And that's an old other story you can go in and read that the young people's class, once we get to Samuel, we'll go through that story. That's something to look forward to. But in the end, 38:21 is an inventory. Let me see what I got here, 38:21. This is the sum of the tabernacle, even of the tabernacle of testimony as it was counted, according to the commandment of Moses, for the service of the Levites by the hand of Ithamar, son of Aaron the priest. All right, and Bezalel, verse 22, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, made all that the Lord commanded Moses. So this is going to be like an inventory. And this here's that Jewish traditional story I was telling you about when the Bible said this Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, and of the tribe of Judah. Why does it go into 3 lines of lineage here just for getting things together? Well, this is where the Jewish tradition says this Hur, his grandfather, was one of the people at the time they built that golden calf. When Moses was gone, they got impatient and didn't think he was ever coming back. Jewish tradition says he stood up and told them they needed to worship the one true God and not this, and they ended up killing him in the camp. So, but like I said, that's Jewish tradition. That's not something you can just rely on. But, the Jews have been around a long time, and they've got, everything that's not in the canon of the Bible. There's a lot of stories, that they've got from their own history too. So, that's just a little to add to it. 38:24, it goes into the shekels. You know, shekels, I think, is a coinage, a measure, a monetary thing now. Back in, it was a measure of weight back then. Like I said, all this gold listed here of these materials, I think it ended up, it's like a ton of gold. That would be like millions of dollars in gold. I mean, it's amazing what it was. Chapter 39, it goes into the garments. All this is repeated of what we read in the earlier chapters. The high priest had, one thing I want to point out before I cancel right here is the high priest, when he would go in and sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat into the Holy of Holies, any other time of the year he had these garments on. It had these jewels on the breastplate, the ephod, etc. like that. He really fancy, beautiful clothes. If you look at it the way it's described, if you put it together, the high priest had a beautiful arrangement of clothes to put on. But that one time a year when he'd go into that Holy of Holies, he was put away them fancy clothes. He wore white in there. He wore white in there, and he done his work, and he come out. He didn't go in the Holy of Holies all fancy before God. And I look at that, and this I'm gonna leave it. I mean, I could have went on 2 or 3 more pages here. But think about that high priest in this Holy of Holies, who came down here and he wasn't all fancy. Who showed up on earth for us? He wasn't all fancy and wearing fancy clothes. Man, he was born in the night, in a manger, whatever you want to call it, in a barn, etc. like that. He wasn't even recognized, or his own people knew he'd been out healing and curing the blind, making the lame to walk, casting out demons. People had been possessed by demons. Nothing fancy. And that's the way that high priest, when he went in there once a year, he wasn't nothing fancy either. He was just the basic clothes. But anyway, I'm running over here. So I'm going to dismiss us with a prayer and get ready for the service.